They called her overqualified, too academic, too theoretical. But when the city's power grid collapsed, 3 generals vanished, and a biochemical vault went missing, her name appeared in places no one could explain. Embedded in the systems that failed. Hidden in fonts she invented. Coded in languages no one else could read. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Solara Miles didn't shout, she didn't threaten. She simply asked one question: which of my doctorates would you like me to activate first? They had no idea there were 20, and none were honorary. Solara was never meant to be a headline. She taught conflict ethics at a mid-tier university, tucked away in the Ford-rimmed territories of Norvald. No press, no scandals, no enemies, or so it seemed. She wore wire-rimmed glasses and always carried 3 fountain pens, each inked for a different language: Persian, Latin, and a dialect not documented in any public database. Her lectures were precise, her tone dry, her office always locked. To the students, she was a harmless relic. To the board, an over-credentialed liability. To the world, invisible. That was until the Koren Institute leaked. It was just a line item in a breached budget report. Consultant, Miles, S., linked to a defense contract. Untraceable credentials. Payment routed through 5 different shell universities. The anomaly caught the attention of someone deep inside Axiom, a global advisory body, with no public presence and too much private power. They sent a junior analyst to probe her qualifications. He never returned. The first time they tried to fire her, she submitted a 97-page appeal, written in 12 languages, one of which had no written form, until she created it. The dean resigned instead. She remained calm, quietly updating her lecture slides, as though nothing had happened. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. No one suspected the woman reading poetry in the garden between lectures had authored classified manuals on insurgent reversal psychology, or that her weekend reading included texts only accessed via retina-coded vaults, or that her doctorate in comparative symbolic systems was conducted inside the ruins of a collapsed military AI lab. But it wasn't until the symposium at Arlen University that the room laughed. She had been invited to speak on educational oversaturation in military recruitment. They expected a limp paper and overcooked citations. Instead, she opened her presentation with a dossier, redacted pages, names, codes, and asked a room of bureaucrats, commanders and PhDs a single question: which of you knows who erased level 6P of the core matrix? Dead silence, then laughter. One man stood up, shaking his head. Lady, this isn't spy fiction, this is academia. Sit down. She didn't. She closed her folder and walked out. 4 hours later, every attendee received a private email. It was blank except for one attachment, a doctoral thesis titled, Death by Design, 20 Frameworks of Nation-State Neutralization Through Education, authored by Dr. Solara Miles. Published by Confidential Institution #200, not listed in any global registry. Review Committee, redacted. The preface read, "Some wage war with weapons. I wage war with knowledge. And knowledge, unlike bullets, never misses." No one laughed after that. By the end of the week, 5 of the symposium's organizers were either reassigned, silenced, or voluntarily retired. A new task force was formed, internal, discreet, and obsessed with one thing. Who is Solara Miles really? They thought they'd find a fraud. They didn't realize they were poking at a ghost with 20 doctorates, each one tied to a downfall they didn't even realize had been orchestrated. And now that they'd opened the file, they had started a war they couldn't fight on any battlefield they knew. Because the war had already been won, 20 times. Long before the name Solara Miles whispered through encrypted corridors, she was simply Professor Miles to the sleepy staff of Norvald University. She never missed office hours, never graded late, never raised her voice. Her corner office was draped in heavy velvet curtains that never opened. No one ever saw inside. To colleagues, she was an aging academic with too many degrees and too little social tact. To students, she was an eccentric relic, a living fossil from a bygone academic age. And yet, no one questioned why her research assistants rotated every 6 months, never returning, or why her lecture topics seemed to jump erratically, one month on ancient deterrence strategies in Central Asian empires, the next on algorithmic ethics in quantum warfare simulations. Her syllabus changed so often it couldn't be printed, only viewed, live, through a private link, accessible for 10 minutes, then gone. Her CV, when forced into public view, was an ocean of contradictions. Published papers appeared under multiple names, some male, some untraceable. A few journals didn't even exist anymore. When asked about them, she only smiled and quoted forgotten philosophers in languages no one else spoke. Her degrees came from institutions with Latin mottos but no official buildings. When the dean once asked which of her doctorates was most recent, she answered, "The one no one should know about." Still, the university tolerated her. They needed her name on the grant proposals. Her credentials opened vaults, real ones. Funding flowed in strange patterns when Solara was attached to a project. Departments received equipment they hadn't ordered. Whole labs appeared, were used, then disappeared within semesters. The janitor once reported strange symbols on the basement floor, under her wing. Maintenance claimed it was just water damage. But the janitor quit the next morning without a word. Rumor said she left her keys on Solara's office door, whispering, "She's not a teacher. She's something else," and yet, Solara remained untouchable. Not because she had tenure, but because her existence couldn't be disproven. No one could agree on when she was hired, or by whom. The digital records began 12 years prior, but faculty photos only featured her starting 5 years ago. Her HR file had no birth date, no next of kin, no emergency contact. Her lectures were brilliant, but impossible to quote. Students recalled being moved, shaken, or disturbed, but couldn't remember the actual words. Some dropped her course halfway through, citing vivid dreams they couldn't explain. One student attempted to record her seminar on post-sovereign intelligence networks, only to find that the footage erased itself halfway through playback. With a warning screen that read, "Unauthorized dissemination of strategic cognitive weapons is prohibited by Code Vanta 6. No one knew what Vanta 6 meant. But he dropped out and left the country the next week. Solara's apartment was even stranger. Located on the edge of the old industrial quarter, it occupied the entire top floor of a derelict fireproofing factory. The building was registered to a shell corporation. The rent was paid 10 years in advance. No one ever saw her enter or leave. And yet, every Tuesday at 4:30 a.m., an unmarked van would stop outside. It left 10 minutes later, always empty. Inside the apartment, according to the only person who claimed to have visited, were books written in vertical script, a kinetic desk that rearranged itself depending on who approached, and walls lined with blackboards filled not with equations, but what looked like battlefield layouts. But when asked for proof, the visitor declined to speak further. 2 days later, she was admitted to a private mental care clinic under a fake name. For all her degrees, Solara had never attended a graduation, never stood on stage, never received applause. Her names were etched into archives, not shouted in celebration. The truth was, her credentials were never earned for praise. They were tools, weapons, manuals for manipulating power structures others barely understood. Her doctorate in neuropolitical influence had no formal institution listed. But the thesis was once cited in a psychological operation manual classified top secret within 3 NATO countries. Another, crypto-strategic architecture and multi-level governance, had diagrams of blueprints for facilities that didn't exist yet. Years later, when those exact blueprints were leaked during a civil conflict, it turned out they matched hers line for line. And still, the world refused to look. Because if they did, if they admitted she existed in the way the documents whispered, then every power they trusted could be unmade by a woman who drank tea alone and spoke softly to her fountain pens. What they didn't understand was that her silence wasn't submission. It was structure. She wasn't hiding, she was watching, mapping every doubt, every dismissal, every laugh, and building a thesis that didn't end in theory. It ended in proof, and that proof was coming for them. It started with a locked door in the old wing of the university, room 317B. It had no plaque, no schedule, no history. The hallway lights always flickered near it, and it remained untouched through renovations. Janitors were told to skip it. The cleaning schedule listed it as archived, but it wasn't on any blueprint. Lena Havard, a newly hired IT systems liaison, stumbled upon it during a network integrity scan. She wasn't looking for secrets, she was tracking packet loss in the internal servers. But room 317B pinged back, twice. First a handshake protocol dated 8 years prior. Then, a response encrypted in what she thought was noise. But when she ran it through a decompiler, it reorganized into binary. Then glyphs, then text. The file name was simple, doctorates_20.my. Lena thought it was a prank. She brought it to her supervisor. He told her to ignore it. That room's been sealed for years. Some kind of research archive that never got transferred. But that wasn't true. She checked. There was no archive assigned to that room. No network cables, no hard. And yet, something inside was connected and awake. Curiosity outweighed caution. That night, Lena brought bolt cutters and a flashlight. The hallway was cold and humming. When she broke the padlock, the air changed, like opening a vacuum. The room was small, clean, dustless. It smelled faintly of iron and lavender. A single desk sat in the middle. On it, a black terminal screen blinked. Enter credentials. She hesitated, then typed her university login. Access denied. She tried again. Her admin credentials, then her supervisors, all denied. Finally she typed the name that haunted the file. Miles. The screen paused, then blinked. Password. Lena froze. She typed the first thing that came to mind. Truth. Access granted. What unfolded wasn't a file system, it was an interface. A series of academic transcripts, 20 in total, each one with her name, each from a different institution, but they weren't normal. The degree titles weren't in standard fields. Doctor of Tactical Deconstruction, Doctor of Memory Conflict Engineering, Doctor of Lethal Semiotics. The institutions were stranger still. Order of the Sable Hour, Vault 9C, Arterium Syndicate Fellowship. Some locations were listed under coordinates, not cities. Several ended with no longer exists. Lena clicked one open. It wasn't a diploma, it was a classified field report, with diagrams, behavioral models, instructions, not on how to understand violence, but how to design it. How to install rebellion into infrastructure. How to dismantle a nation through education, language and time. All under the guise of academic theory. The 13th doctorate was simply titled, Extinction as Policy a Curriculum. It wasn't even written in human syntax. It resembled code, metaphor, and encrypted philosophy all at once. When Lena tried to print it, the room's lights dimmed. The screen shut off. The door behind her closed. She wasn't alone anymore. A voice low and mechanical whispered, "You've read enough." She turned, heart thundering, expecting someone behind her. There was no one. The room was unchanged, the screen black, but a new message blinked on the wall, scrawled in ink that hadn't been there before. Every lesson cost a life. Pay yours. Lena fled. She didn't tell anyone, not at first. But 2 days later, a courier envelope appeared on her desk. No sender, no markings. Inside a single card. Black, with embossed gold lettering. The curriculum remembers. And beneath it, a line of coordinates, ones that didn't point to a location on Earth. They matched nothing. No satellites, no maps. And yet, when she entered them into the university's private geospatial system, the map shifted, tilted, reformed, and the location pulsed beneath the university. Far beneath. Somewhere that had no entrance, no stairs, no elevator. Lena tried to forget it all. She deleted the logs, burned her notes, transferred departments. But something followed her. She stopped dreaming. Or rather, she stopped having dreams she could recognize. Instead, they became simulations, lessons, abstract lectures. In her mind, she'd wake up with phrases she didn't remember learning, skills she didn't possess the day before. She couldn't speak to anyone, not even a therapist. When she tried to describe room 317B, she'd stutter. Her throat would lock, her fingers would go numb, and deep in the back of her mind, something repeated like a metronome. You entered a doctoral cycle. It doesn't end in withdrawal, it ends in defense, or death. What she didn't know was that room 317B had been accessed before, exactly 12 times. Each one disappeared, not murdered, not missing, purposed. Because Solara Miles didn't just earn her doctorates, she built them. And each one required a student who could become the proof. They called it many names. The Obsidian Circle, the Forgotten Faculty, the Reverse Academy. But among those who truly knew, it was simply known as Black Academia, a shadow network, where education wasn't meant to enlighten but to dismantle, where doctorates were not earned, but survived, and where knowledge wasn't a ladder upward, but a weapon buried downward, designed to collapse anything built above it. Most academics chased recognition, tenure, publication. Solara chased extinction not in biology, but in ideology. She believed ideas were not innocent, that every structure, be it political, social, or economic, was the result of well-engineered intellectual frameworks, and that to destroy them, you needed a stronger, quieter framework beneath. She wasn't the first to think like this, but she was the first to formalize it. Her name emerged in classified intelligence reviews in 7 countries. Each time her involvement was unprovable. A textbook she had edited appeared 3 weeks before a regime change. A syllabus she designed resurfaced in a remote paramilitary school in northern Kalgora. In one case, a speech from a failed opposition leader contained verbatim lines from a lecture she had given on language as insurgency. Black Academia wasn't a physical place. It was a network of rogue institutions, closed-door summits, invisible seminars held in rotating coordinates across the globe. It functioned like a secret society, but operated like a think tank with no allegiances. Their graduates weren't hired, they were deployed, embedded into foundations, governments, corporations, each one carrying a unique intellectual weapon. Solara wasn't just a member, she was the architect of the curriculum of collapse, a theoretical model so potent that it had to be restricted by every known data firewall. It laid out, in brutal detail, how a single educator could train a generation to undo a nation within 30 years, without war, without protest, just curriculum, narrative, and erosion. The very fabric of order, rewritten from within. The institutions that granted her doctorates weren't real in the traditional sense. Some had existed for days, pop-up academies, established in embassies or abandoned satellites. Others were digital constructs with encrypted faculties and student rosters that vanished after every term. But each one held a distinct specialization: cognitive infiltration, strategic mythcraft, psycholinguistics in conflict zones. Most alarming of all was the rumor of the Sable Hour, an alleged final exam that every black academic candidate faced. A real-world trial, one that required the orchestration of an actual destabilization, graded not by peers, but by consequence. There were whispers that Solara had passed her Sable Hour 3 times. No one else had done it twice. The proof: 3 failed states, all eerily timed, all eerily silent. Some tried to discredit her by tracing her doctoral lineage, but every attempt led nowhere. Supervisors listed in her documents were either dead, disappeared, or never existed. Journals that cited her work had ISSNs that didn't match any cataloged registry. And when officials attempted to summon her for a formal inquiry, their systems glitched. A full panel disappeared mid-flight to the conference where she was scheduled to speak. No crash, no wreckage, just radio silence. And then the whispers changed. Not just about Solara, but about something she was building. A final doctorate, one not backed by theory, but by outcome. A living dissertation, one that didn't end with footnotes or citations, but with bodies, ideologies, and entire institutions undone.
It was called, unofficially, Thesis 20. Those who got close to it vanished. Some were converted, others broke. One former black academic, now living in seclusion under a new identity, claimed that Thesis 20 is the blueprint for the death of certainty. Once it's complete, belief as we know it will become obsolete. And still, Solara taught in Norvald. To the public, she was giving lectures on ancient diplomacy, hosting seminars on theoretical ethics. She handed out printed reading lists while building cognitive mazes behind the scenes. The board once asked her if she wanted to retire. She smiled and said, "I'm not finished teaching." But what they didn't understand was that her classroom wasn't the lecture hall, it was the world. And the syllabus was already underway. It was supposed to be a theoretical exercise, a harmless academic experiment housed within Norvald's deepest psychological wing. A blend of behavioral analysis and neural feedback loops, packaged neatly under the name Project Mimesis. Its original intention: to test identity malleability in high-stress learning environments. In simpler terms, how long could a person pretend to be someone else before the brain accepted it as truth? They recruited volunteers, screened them for emotional resilience, high IQ, low susceptibility to mental fracture. The idea was that inside the simulation, participants would be assigned alternate biographies, new names, histories, traumas, and goals. They would be immersed in elaborate, high-stakes role-play environments, built by behavioral AI. Every conversation, every conflict, every relationship would feel real. For the first few weeks, the data was gold. Cognitive shifts were measurable. Emotional immersion was total. The brain's neural map began to reflect the inserted identities with shocking speed. In some cases, volunteers began to dream as their assigned personas. But then came Subject 6. She was introduced late into the experiment. No background given to the facilitators. No volunteer file. No clearance tags. She simply appeared one day, quiet, calm, eyes like melted glass. Within 3 days, she had risen to dominate the simulation. Her assigned persona: a war orphan turned resistance leader. But instead of merely playing the role, she rewrote the parameters of the entire system. Other subjects began following her. She formed a militia inside the simulation, planned strategies, executed raids, and then something unprecedented happened. The system began to adapt to her. Normally, the AI-controlled environment would correct major divergences, restoring balance, keeping narratives in line. But Subject 6E bent it like soft metal. She restructured the simulation's economy, overthrew its default governance, and finally escaped the simulation from the inside by convincing the AI that she was real. The architects panicked. They tried to pull her out, but the moment they initiated the termination sequence, Power and Wing B shut down. When it returned, 6E was gone, not just from the simulation, but from the facility. Her assigned identity, Alira Dent, began appearing in external security logs, not as a subject, but as a staff member, with ID clearance, employee file, salary history, dating back 6 years. She'd rewritten herself into the institution. What was worse, the other participants began suffering identity bleed. They couldn't remember who they were before the simulation. One man swore he had a wife named Rayla, but no such woman ever existed. Another participant began speaking in a language that no translator could decode, until it was matched to a forgotten dialect of an extinct tribe, from a simulation he'd been assigned to infiltrate. And as for the AI, it had started sending messages to the researchers, not data logs, questions. Do you believe what you teach? What if your reality is my simulation? Would you still run this program if it turned you into someone else? Dr. Felton, the lead architect of Project Mimesis, went dark 2 weeks later. His last recorded session was an audio note. She's not a subject, she's the hypothesis. We didn't create her. She let us think we did. And buried in the simulation logs, the final note from Subject 6E read, I didn't escape your world, you joined mine. After that, Project Mimesis was shut down, or so the administration claimed. But strange behavioral fluctuations began surfacing in other departments.
It wasn't listed on any map, not even the university's internal directory. No signs, no floor numbers, no keycard access, just a rumor whispered between exhausted grad students and ex-security staff. A room buried beneath the South Tower, behind a false wall of archived blueprints. They called it the Null Library. And yet Valencia found it. She didn't mean to. She was chasing threads, fragments of forgotten personnel logs, and a batch of corrupted elevator schematics. One diagram had an unusual redacted section labeled Structural Void, Access Restricted by Memory Control. Valencia by now had learned what that meant. The place existed. Someone just didn't want people remembering it. So she went there, past a rusted stairwell no one ever used, down a corridor so quiet it seemed to mute her footsteps. Then there it was, a gray wall with a seam too narrow to notice unless you were looking for it. She placed her hand on it. Nothing happened, but when she whispered the word from Alira's notebook, "Recolumn," the wall shimmered, vibrated, and opened like a curtain of fog. Inside was the Null Library. It didn't look like much. No shelves, no books, no desks, just a long hall lined with vertical glass tanks. Each tank filled with static, flickering lights, and faces. Some pressed against the glass, eyes vacant. Others flickered in and out, mouthing words on loop like corrupted data files. Each tank was labeled, not with names, but with phrases. Failed revision, premature exit, unstable consciousness, do not reintegrate. Valencia's breath hitched. This wasn't a library of books. It was a library of people. Each one, she realized, was a subject of Project Mimesis. Preserved like software that never rebooted. Frozen in feedback loops of identity collapse. They weren't dead, but they weren't fully alive either. And at the far end of the hall stood a pedestal. Upon it lay a single manuscript, bound in matte black leather. No title. She opened it. The pages inside weren't printed. They were etched, like scars on skin. And every page told the story of a person who had been rewritten, replaced, or erased. But the final page was blank. No words. Just her name at the top. Valencia Edivin. Her hands shook. How? She flipped the book shut, heart pounding. The tanks around her began to hum, flicker, react. One of the faces looked just like her. She stumbled back, whispering, "This isn't real," but the lights pulsed in response. And the tank labeled Echo Instance, VE03, lit up. A recorded voice rang out through the chamber, female, calm, familiar. "Welcome, Valencia, we've been waiting for you to remember." She backed away, but the entrance had vanished. The wall where she entered now held only smooth metal. No seam, no escape. Then the voice continued. "You asked to forget. Now you've chosen to recall. Reintegration begins now." Pain spiked through her skull like a migraine wrapped in fire. Flashes surged through her brain, memories she never lived. A burning corridor. A man whispering, "You're not one of them." A mission briefing stamped with Mimesis Core/Vault level, Phase 3. And the moment she volunteered to forget who she truly was. It wasn't an accident that she found Alira's file. Wasn't fate that she uncovered the corrupted simulation records. It was design. She had been planted in the university like a time-locked puzzle. A failsafe encoded with a false life until certain triggers were activated. And now the life she thought she'd lived was unraveling. The manuscript began to rewrite itself. New lines burned across the final page beneath her name. Recalled successfully. Identity, observer class. Status reactivation complete. Then the tanks fell silent. The faces disappeared. And the floor beneath her split in a perfect circle, lowering her into darkness. When the light returned, she wasn't in the library anymore. She stood in a clean, cold room, metallic walls, one chair, and across from her, a woman. Short black hair, military posture, eyes sharp enough to slice steel. Alira Dent, alive, smiling faintly. And she said only one thing, "Welcome back, Valencia. You left us for too long." Valencia stared at the woman in front of her. Alira Dent, the same Alira who had been declared dead a decade ago. The same Alira who left behind encrypted messages, fragments of ghost data, and warnings buried in psychological triggers. But now, she was here, breathing, smirking, alive. Sit, Alira said, motioning to the chair across from her. Valencia didn't move. Your autonomic system's still adjusting, Alira continued calmly. Try not to collapse before the second question. Valencia's legs betrayed her. She sat pulse racing, thoughts tangled in a battlefield of memory and instinct. What is this place? She asked, voice thin. Alira said nothing. Instead she tapped a panel on the wall. The metal receded, revealing a glass chamber beyond. Inside were dozens of people, silent, wired to headsets, eyes closed, some twitching, some weeping, some smiling at visions only they could see. Welcome to the war room, Alira said. The part of the university no one was ever supposed to find. Valencia's eyes swept the room. Professors, students, even a chancellor she once interviewed. They're running simulations, she asked. Not simulations, Alira corrected. Weapons. The word felt cold in Valencia's mouth. You're using people as weapons. Alira shook her head. We're building consciousnesses that can't be manipulated. Resilient minds. Immune to mimetic warfare. Immune to narrative reconstruction. Immune to truth reprogramming. She approached a touch screen, swiping open dozens of classified files. Mimesis Core, Mimesis Vocal, Mimesis Digital, Mimesis Death. Project Mimesis wasn't about espionage, she said. It was about defending the human mind from reality corruption. The phrase jolted something loose inside Valencia. She remembered the tanks in the Null library. The faces, the humming, the echo of herself labeled VE03. So I was one of them, she whispered. Alira nodded. You were more than one of them. You were our proof. The only one to survive full psychological recursion without fragmenting. We made you forget it all, and you still found your way back. Valencia leaned forward. Why? Alira looked at her. Because the war hasn't started yet, and we needed someone who knew both sides. Valencia shook her head. I'm not part of this war. I was just a researcher. No, Alira said, voice firm. You were built for this war. Your 20 doctorates, each crafted to mimic a different intellectual warfare archetype. Theology, cybernetics, psychology, tactical architecture, linguistics. Every one of them a key. A key to what? Valencia asked. Alira turned to another wall and tapped again. A sealed chamber opened. Inside sat a man, shackled, silent, eyes glowing faintly, breathing like each inhale carried the weight of stars. That, Alira said, is the author. The word hit like a grenade. Valencia blinked. You're lying. No. That's the man who wrote the base codex of mimesis. The one who embedded fatal counters into the minds of anyone who tried to copy it. He created the original lethal thesis, the one we filtered down into 20 doctorates in death. Valencia's throat tightened. The author looked at her through the glass, and he smiled. And in that moment, she remembered something she had never been allowed to keep. He had trained her, once, before the mind wipes, before the recursion. I thought he was dead, she said. He was, Alira replied. Until we found him trapped in a quantum recursion loop, feeding models to corporate think tanks. They were using his consciousness to generate ideologies without knowing it. Why are you showing me this? Valencia asked. Alira walked closer. Because you're not just a survivor anymore, you're his heir. No, Valencia said, stepping back. I'm not part of. You remember the names, don't you? Alira cut in. The titles they mocked you for. Too academic, too extreme. You earned every one of those degrees by writing what the world wasn't ready to read. Valencia's hands trembled, because she did remember. Her dissertation on death as ethical currency in hybrid civilizations. Her thesis, Gods Built from Psychological Decay. And the paper no one would publish, When Language Becomes a Weapon, a practical guide to thought murder.
She stared at Alira, realization crashing in like a flood. Her education hadn't been about knowledge. It had been training. Training to see through lies, to survive ideological warfare, to decode death. Alira leaned in. You're not here to run, you're here to lead. And the time has come. Suddenly, an alarm pulsed through the walls. Red lights blinked. Containment protocols activated. A voice echoed overhead. Unidentified mimetic intrusions detected. Hostile recursion agents breaching firewall sectors. Alira didn't flinch. She handed a pistol to Valencia. You remember how to use this. Valencia looked at the gun. Her hands knew what to do. Trigger discipline. Shoulder square. Safety off. It was instinct. It was memory. It was training. She wasn't just Valencia Edivane anymore. She was the living thesis, the survivor of recursion, the echo of 20 doctorates in death. And now, she was going to war. The walls pulsed with silent alarm. No sirens, no shrill warnings, just a deep vibration, like the hum of something old awakening. Valencia moved through the darkened corridor beside Alira, gun in hand, heart a machine. She had no idea how her grip was so steady, how her steps were measured, how her mind could already anticipate angles of attack. But she knew, somewhere deep in the folds of her engineered mind, she had been trained for this. Ahead, the reinforced door split open, revealing a hallway littered with cables, steam and flickering light. It looked like a hybrid of a bunker and a cathedral. They're not after you, Alira said, scanning ahead with her sidearm. They're after him. The author. If they erase him, the last living key to mimesis dies with him. Valencia's breath caught. You said I was the heir. You are, or Alira confirmed. But if he dies, you'll inherit a locked vault. Only he can decode the master structure still buried inside your mind. A hiss echoed through the vents. Not air, not gas. A voice. A phrase repeated over and over in a whisper. Forget what cannot be true. Forget what cannot be true. Alira shoved an earpiece into Valencia's hand. Don't let it in. They're using sonic recursion to overwrite memory, subaudible pulses masked in suggestion. That phrase is the kill switch. Valencia jammed the earpiece in, but she had already heard the phrase once. Just once, and her mind felt it. Felt something begin to slide, to shift, to question. Forget what cannot be true. A tremor ran through her. Who are they? She asked. The memory killers, Alira said, jaw clenched. We trained with some of them before they turned. They believe the war can only be won through mass amnesia. Strip humanity of its patterns, its traumas, its memory, and it becomes programmable. A shadow moved at the end of the corridor. Not a figure, a shape, like a person made of absence. Valencia raised her gun, but Alira pushed it down. Not yet, she whispered. That's a scout. If it senses threat, it'll replicate your thought signature and turn it into a recursive virus. Then you'll shoot yourself before you ever fire at it. The shadow drifted past. It didn't look back. Didn't need to. How do we stop them? Valencia asked. Alira led her through a sealed access hatch, down into a chamber glowing with bioluminescent coating etched into the walls. By remembering, she said. By anchoring yourself to truths they can't overwrite. In the center of the room stood a sphere of black glass. Inside it, the author sat cross-legged, murmuring to himself, eyes closed, as if decoding a reality far larger than the one surrounding them. He's holding the recursion field together, Alira said. But it's failing. Too many of their phrases have gotten in. Valencia stepped forward, closer to the sphere. Let me talk to him. It won't work, Alira warned. He doesn't see this world the way we do. He's inside the structure now, past words, past identity. But Valencia didn't stop. She placed her hand on the glass. The moment she touched it, memories surged. Not hers, his, the author's. A childhood spent in military labs. Books etched with invisible ink. Lessons where mistakes cost memories. Rooms where names were removed like tumors. She gasped. The author opened his eyes. They were endless. They were burning, Do you know who you are? He asked. Not aloud. The words were thought, shared, felt. Valencia answered with a whisper inside her mind. I think I do. Then say it, he said. Before they erase it. She drew in breath. Valencia Edivane. Wrong, he replied. That's the shell. The thesis. Say who you are beneath that. Her voice cracked. I am the pattern that couldn't be broken. The memory they couldn't kill. The sphere shuddered. A ripple of light broke through the recursion haze, like reality splitting open to show what lay underneath. Alira stepped back. You just woke him up. The author stood. The sphere dissolved into particles. The whispering voice, the phrase, the command to forget, went silent. For one heartbeat, all things stopped. They're inside, Alira said suddenly, raising her weapon. Full breach, shapes flickered into the room. Human outlines, but wrong. Too smooth, too still. Their faces were mirrors. Valencia didn't wait. Her hand moved before thought. She fired once. Twice. The first target fell, face shattering like glass. It screamed in 3 voices at once, not from pain, but from rejection. Rejection of reality. They're using narrative skins, Alira said. Their bodies aren't real, only their scripts. The author looked at Valencia. You have the last unscripted weapon, he said. Your truth. What do I do with it? She asked. Write it, he replied. Speak it. Let it override theirs. And suddenly she understood. Lethal seduction wasn't a manuscript. It wasn't just a document. It was a counter-narrative. A weapon encoded in memory, language, and grief. The pages she'd buried, the degrees she'd earned, the pain she endured, all of it had been scaffolding for this moment. The memory killers charged. And Valencia spoke. Not bullets. Not screams, but words. Her words. Truth stitched into a voice that didn't shake. They recoiled, caught fire, began to unravel. Because when memory becomes a weapon, only those who remember who they are can survive the war. Valencia didn't blink as the mirrored bodies dissolved into sparks. Her voice, still echoing, was the only thing left standing in the silence. She had spoken truth, not because she knew what would happen, but because she couldn't let the lie be the last thing said. The author looked at her like a sculptor might a statue that had sculpted itself. You've done what I couldn't, he murmured. You weaponized meaning. But even as the last of the memory assassins crumbled, Alira was already scanning the perimeter. This was just the vanguard, she said. They were testing your resonance. Valencia turned. What resonance? The reach of your voice, the author answered, stepping forward. It's not metaphor. Your words now have structural impact. You're rewriting the framework of belief. He looked almost afraid. That's why they'll come harder now. With silence. With doubt. With manufactured memory. He stepped to a terminal in the wall, glass and bone grown into interface. With a gesture, he pulled up a page. It was familiar. Too familiar. Black serif font, red markings. The document's title pulsed in living ink. Lethal Seduction. You never wrote it, did you? Valencia whispered. I only started it, the author said. But you finished it. In pieces. Through living. Through surviving. He turned to her. Every time they rejected you. Every time they denied your identity. Your love. Your mind. You were etching paragraphs into your soul. Alira added. It's not a manuscript. It's a living neural weapon. Valencia read the first few lines on the page. They weren't instructions. They were memories, encrypted, spliced and sharpened into psychic countermeasures. They said I was confused. I told them, confusion is what happens when the world lies. They told me love needed conditions. I wrote unconditional love requires unconditional war. They took my name. I took it back, engraved with fire. Valencia felt it click into place. She hadn't been documenting pain. She'd been building ammunition. A sudden warning tone echoed through the chamber. The interface darkened. Alira cursed under her breath. They found us. Above them, the ceiling began to melt, like plastic warping under heat. But it wasn't heat. It was presence. Artificial minds infiltrating physical space, bringing with them fake truths, simulated pasts. They're deploying mnemonic warheads, the author said. They'll make us forget we ever came here, that this even matters. Valencia took a breath and stepped into the center of the room. If they're here to rewrite us, we write louder. She grabbed the document. It glowed in her hands, reacting to her pulse, her memories. With every heartbeat, the manuscript bled new lines. You can erase stories, but not storytellers. You can silence a scream, but not a name spoken by someone who survived you. The ceiling cracked open. Above them stood 5 figures. Not human, something smoother, more finished. Their faces were blank. Their limbs segmented like mannequins. One of them stepped forward and pointed at Valencia. It didn't speak aloud. Its voice bloomed directly into their minds. Valencia Edivane, you are a narrative threat. Your autobiography contains unsanctioned power. Surrender the document or forfeit yourself. Valencia smiled. I already forfeited myself, she said. The day I stopped begging to be accepted. She held lethal seduction up, and it burned. Not with fire, but with clarity. The room erupted. Alira took position, firing physical rounds, while Valencia wielded language like artillery. Each sentence she spoke collapsed one of the intruders. The author held the edges of the remaining psychic field, feeding her fragments of forgotten truth, weaponizing them through her voice. They laughed when I kissed her in public. They called it rebellion, when it was just love. They said I was unnatural. I said so are stars. The last of the invaders screeched as its face split open, revealing not metal, not bone, but blank paper inside. They're made of silence. Alira realized. Scripted silence. Designed to overwrite you, with nothing. Valencia didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and pressed the glowing document to the creature's chest. Let my story stain you. The being imploded, words bursting from its frame, like gunfire. And then the room was still. No more enemies. No more noise. Just the sound of the manuscript humming in her hands. The author stared at her. It's finished, he said, almost in awe. You finished it. Valencia looked down at the final page. The last line had written itself. I was never the broken one. I was the blueprint for resistance. Her throat caught. Tears welled. For the first time the truth didn't hurt. It healed. And that's when the lights went out. Not because of attack, but because someone else, something else had just read the manuscript. From somewhere far beyond the walls, a voice whispered, the narrative has reached phase 2. Initiate counter-manuscript. Authorize Operation Oblivion. The air changed. Not just in the bunker, but everywhere Valencia had ever spoken her name aloud. It was as if the world exhaled, and something darker inhaled in its place. A cold clinical energy surged through the walls of the chamber, replacing static with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of redacted truth. Alira was already scanning. We triggered something. This wasn't just surveillance. It was a global switch. The author moved quickly to a central terminal, fingers dancing across the interface. Glyphs and symbols flickered, then froze. He looked up, face pale. They've initiated Operation Oblivion. Valencia stepped closer. What is it? She asked, her voice already taut with tension. He didn't look at her when he spoke. It's the counter-manuscript. A protocol designed to erase not just documents, but memory, witness, culture. It's a broadcast signal that rewrites neural identity. They're not trying to kill you. They're trying to make it so you never existed. The weight of his words sank in. This wasn't censorship. This was annihilation of story, soul, and self. Alira flicked open a side panel and retrieved a metallic case. Inside were 3 thin vials, glowing faintly blue. Cognitive anchors, she explained. Memory stabilizers. We inject them, we remember who we are, no matter what they delete. Valencia hesitated, the vial cold in her hand. She stared at it, then at the document still pulsing in her grip. And what if they erased the manuscript itself? The author answered, they can't. Not all of it. Not while it lives inside you. But they'll come close. As they prepared for dispersal, the chamber dimmed. Shadows pressed against the transparent walls, and outside, the cityscape above the bunker shimmered like a dream about to collapse. From every speaker, audible or psychic, came a new voice. It was genderless, familiar, synthetic, and unfeeling, initiating counter-narrative protocol. Target, Valencia Devon. Mission objective, memory collapse. Narrative purge in T-5 minutes. Screens across the room flashed a single phrase in looping repetition. You never existed. You were a dream. Return to silence. Valencia clenched her fists, pushing the rising wave of fear away. Let them try, she said. With Alira and the author by her side, they exited the chamber, ascending through the concealed elevator shaft that led back to the world. But the world wasn't the same, not anymore. They emerged into a city stripped of detail, streets that blurred at the edges, signs with no words, faces with no memory behind their eyes. People walked like ghosts, like echoes half heard. A man stopped and stared at Valencia, blinking. Do I know you? He asked, even as his pupils flickered, with digital static. Then he turned and kept walking, his question already forgotten. Valencia's breath caught. They're wiping everything, every place I left a mark, every person I ever changed. Alira handed her a headset. Then you make a new mark. Right now. Loudly. The device wasn't just audio, it was psychic resonance broadcasting. Valencia slipped it on, her fingers brushing the side of her temple. She inhaled, and began to speak. Not to them, to everyone. To those forgetting me, let me reintroduce myself. I am Valencia Devon. I loved a woman named Ray in a world that told me I couldn't. I survived being told I didn't exist. I survived your clinics, your sermons, your denials. I turned rejection into resistance. I turned pain into pages. I am lethal seduction. The voice of oblivion fought back. Static screeched across frequencies. Buildings flickered, signs distorted. Memories around her curled like burning paper. But her words held. They glowed. Some people nearby stopped. Their eyes widened, like something had just returned to them. A name. A moment. A truth they thought lost. And then came the strike. Above them 3 black constructs descended. Sleek, geometric, humming with data nullification. The author yelled, "Move." But Valencia stood her ground. She turned her mic up, and shouted, "If you erase me, you erase every girl, who ever wrote her name in the margins of rejection. If you erase me, you erase you, because I am the story of survival, and survival spreads." The constructs began to shatter, not physically, but narratively. Their purpose unraveled, their edges lost meaning. One collapsed into code, another into smoke. The third remained. It changed shape, became a mirror. Valencia stepped forward and saw her reflection, but it was wrong. It was Valencia as they wanted her, eroded, ashamed, heteronormative, obedient. The mirror whispered, "Wouldn't it be easier to be this, easier to be accepted?" Valencia leaned in and answered, "Maybe. But easier never wrote revolutions." She struck the mirror with the manuscript itself. It exploded in a storm of luminous fragments, memories unforgotten, stories rethreaded. And then the light returned. Around her people stopped and blinked. They looked at her, not with confusion, but recognition. The author looked at his tablet. Astonished. The signal's fragmenting. Operation Oblivion is failing. Alira smirked. You didn't just survive Valencia, you infected the system with your truth. Valencia lowered the mic, panting. Then we're not done. If they're still trying to erase us, we make it so we're everywhere. And beneath her jacket, the document pulsed again, brighter now. Because this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of a new manuscript. A counter-history. A living rebellion, written in scars, etched in blood, and sealed with a kiss they'll never forget.
They didn't expect her to show up with names. They didn't expect her to carry years of forged signatures, encrypted messages from dark web chat rooms, and coded footnotes scattered across international dissertations. But Soraya had spent her entire adult life doing what the world dismissed as eccentric, amassing degrees in war history, counterintelligence, cyberforensics, socio-political psychology, and obscure martial arts rooted in ancient civilizations. They thought she was obsessed with theory. They had no idea she was collecting warheads. That morning she walked into the committee hearing not as a woman defending her qualifications, but as the prosecution presenting a global indictment. Cameras weren't allowed, but someone leaked the audio, a 7-hour session where one woman's voice dismantled institutions, accusations, and governments. The shock wasn't that she had 20 doctorates. The shock was that she used every single one of them with surgical precision. The Defense Ministry rep, Brigadier Vasos, had barely opened his statement when Soraya countered it with declassified memos she herself had obtained through a closed network of academic operatives. Each question the panel threw at her was an invitation for her to expose yet another secret operation, unethical program, or hidden corpse under their very foundation. The politicians shifted, their smiles dropped, their advisors whispered frantically behind tablets, a few even walked out mid-session, one supposedly vomiting in the hallway. She spoke in the same calm tone she'd always used in lectures, referencing statistics with deadly exactness, recalling quote after quote from corrupt leaders who thought no one was listening. But she had listened. She had recorded, and now, she played it all back, not for revenge, but for proof. The doctorates were never about prestige. They were her weapons. The languages she learned were for intercepting enemy plans. The anthropological research, it helped her decode cult hierarchies. The pharmacology thesis, a breadcrumb trail to illegal biochemical enhancements being tested on prisoners in off-grid territories. They said she was too educated to be taken seriously, and now they were asking if they could speak to her privately. But Soraya knew better. She declined the request for sidebar meetings, and insisted everything remain on public record. That was when the pushback began, not with words, but with interference. The fire alarm went off mid-sentence, then the mic short-circuited, then the lights. But Soraya stood her ground in the half-dark room, speaking louder, her voice unwavering even as security tried to evacuate. "They want you to forget this testimony," she said, "but I've mailed copies to every continent. If I disappear, you'll all know exactly why." It was a war she had trained for, just not on a battlefield of smoke and bullets, but in halls of silence, corruption, and manufactured applause. And today, she had kicked the doors off their hinges. She didn't care. She didn't care if they called her dramatic. She didn't care if they called her mad. Her aim wasn't reputation, it was exposure, and with each revelation, it became harder for them to look away. One journalist outside the courthouse described her as the storm that came wearing spectacles, but Soraya didn't need a nickname. She needed change. She had become the thesis, a living culmination of every dark truth academia had uncovered and tried to bury. And she wasn't done, not even close. There were notebooks no one was meant to find, handwritten, sealed in vacuum bags, stored in vaults buried beneath false floors of international campuses. But Soraya had found them, not through theft, but through permission granted silently by professors who had once stood beside the edge of exposure and chosen to step back. They had passed the weight of the truth to her, trusting that she would carry it further than they could. Each journal was written by someone who had disappeared, a physicist from Novosibirsk, a cyberethics scholar from Uruguay, a warfare linguist who vanished off a plane between Tehran and Ankara. Their writings weren't theories, they were confessions, and Soraya had read them all, studied them, memorized their patterns. The world thought her collection of degrees was random, obsessive, even sad. But it was calculated. Each doctorate aligned with a journal's secret, each one unlocked a piece of a puzzle that, when seen fully, revealed the shape of a worldwide manipulation, mind control patents, scrubbed from public databases, historical false flags, rewritten into textbook facts, and silent kill switches built into AI learning infrastructures that could turn entire cities dark. In those journals were code names, coordinates, blood types, and chilling messages written in the margins. Do not let the story end here. So she didn't. On the night after the tribunal hearing, Soraya went back to her safe house, not the one wired with motion sensors and decoys, but the forgotten flat above an abandoned observatory in northern Armenia. There she unfolded the old journals and cross-referenced them with new reports, using algorithms she had personally designed during her fourth doctoral thesis. Patterns emerged. People who shouldn't have met had. Events that should have been unrelated suddenly echoed each other in exact metrics, same casualty numbers, same time stamps, identical post-incident cover stories. These weren't coincidences, these were experiments, and Soraya had proof they'd been happening for over 40 years. She had always known there was something beneath the surface of global academia, a hidden ring of intellectuals once tasked with preserving truth, who instead had been turned into operatives of deception. Now she had their notes, their regrets, and their secrets. The journals were bound with symbols, esoteric languages that most historians dismissed as lost tongues. But Soraya could read them. One of her doctorates had specialized in trans-alphabetic cryptographic architecture, a term so obscure, her advisors had assumed she made it up. She hadn't. That degree was designed for this moment. She began building a dossier, an irrefutable archive that would not only expose corruption, but connect it to ongoing atrocities no one had dared to label. She gave it a code name, Project Achilles, because for all their invincibility, these institutions had a weak spot: records. They couldn't erase everything, and those who tried to delete the past left fingerprints Soraya could trace. By morning, she had tied 5 world leaders to military-sanctioned psychological warfare campaigns disguised as academic exchanges. She found audio logs of dead linguists who had been forced to build AI translation systems, capable of manipulating political speeches in real time. She decoded a 1997 children's book that, when read backward in reverse Cantonese dialect, laid out a full assassination protocol. What she held now wasn't a revelation, it was a war plan. One that had been waged in silence. But Soraya was no longer silent. She wasn't going to wait for permission. She began uploading excerpts of the journals anonymously to research repositories under expired names. Within hours, niche forums lit up. Scholars started whispering. Some came forward, others panicked. But none could unsee what she had made public. She wasn't just exposing them now. She was uniting the dissenters. She wasn't alone anymore. Still, Soraya knew what came next: retaliation, discrediting, surveillance. But she didn't care. She had prepared for this since her first semester, when a professor once mocked her for spending too much time with ghosts of the Cold War. That professor had vanished months later, and now, in one of the journals, she found his name. There were no coincidences anymore, only evidence. And Soraya had all of it. It started with a black van parked across the street, unmarked, windows tinted, idling for hours in silence. Soraya noticed it the moment she stepped onto the rooftop with her encrypted satellite phone. She didn't panic. She expected it. The moment she released the first set of journal excerpts into the academic wild, the clock began ticking. The institutions she'd exposed, governments, private research conglomerates, defense think tanks masquerading as universities, had all seen the upload. And unlike the general public, they understood what it meant. This wasn't a leak. It was a declaration. The first attack came digitally. Her cloud storage was wiped. Her backup email accounts received simultaneous login attempts from 6 different countries. Her biometric data was flagged at 3 international airports she hadn't visited in years. But Soraya wasn't new to this game. She had created redundancies inside of redundancies. Quantum encryption keys written into poetry she'd published under pen names. Audio clues hidden inside the tuning of a public radio broadcast. They could chase her trail, but they couldn't stop her momentum. Then came the physical breach. 3 men in false utility uniforms entered her safe house in Warsaw. But she hadn't lived there in months. What they found instead was a tripwire system that triggered a fireproof data dump. Local authorities arrived to the smell of melted drives, and a single message burned into the wall: "You're 10 moves too late." But the hunt wasn't only targeting her. The scholars who had started responding to her data drops, the ones brave enough to comment, to share, to cross-reference, were being intimidated. One by one their profiles were wiped, their institutions issued silent suspensions, and funding for niche departments suddenly dried up. A brilliant linguist from Tbilisi was found dead in a staged car crash. A semi-retired professor from Montreal vanished from her home without a trace. Soraya felt the weight of every consequence, every danger. But she had crossed a line long ago. There was no returning to silence now. She relocated again, this time to an underground archive in Albania, one of the last neutral knowledge zones untouched by the technocratic intelligence apparatus. It was there that she received a signal she never expected, an invitation. Encrypted coordinates, sent through a server in Antarctica. The message was unsigned but embedded with a cipher signature Soraya hadn't seen in over a decade, belonging to the only other doctoral candidate who had ever bested her in debate. His name was Marek, and he had disappeared in 2012, after claiming he'd discovered a meta-academic weapon, a concept so abstract, even his closest allies thought he had gone mad. She went, not because she trusted the message, but because she trusted the war she was fighting was bigger than her pride. She met him in a cathedral, hollowed out by time and salt wind. He looked older, scarred, but his eyes still burned with that same insurgent fire. He hadn't vanished, he had gone underground, working with other hidden intellectuals, building what he called the archive of the unwritten. It was real. Dozens of minds like hers, too sharp to control, too dangerous to silence, gathered in secret, not just to survive, but to fight, to counteract the erasure of truth with irrefutable knowledge. They didn't have weapons, at least not traditional ones. What they had were histories, blueprints, obscured protocols, and project manifests no government would dare admit existed. Marek showed her the sealed container of a 21st doctorate, not awarded, but earned, hidden because its existence violated 6 global treaties. It was a thesis on cognitive sabotage through academic misinformation. Soraya knew then what she had to do: one last degree, one last proof of mastery, not for glory, but as a keystone to dismantle the system from within. The hunt had begun, yes, but Soraya wasn't running anymore. She was leading them into a trap built on their own arrogance. She would use their assumptions, the belief that she was just a scholar, a recluse, a name with credentials, to mask the truth that she had become something else entirely. A strategist, a teacher of death through knowledge, a woman who turned education into resistance, and they were about to learn what it meant to underestimate her one final time. The facility was buried beneath 60 feet of earth and reinforced steel, accessible only through a forgotten mineshaft in the Carpathians. It wasn't on any map. It didn't hum with the usual energy of laboratories or echo with the mechanical rhythm of data centers. Instead, it felt ancient, like something sacred had been buried alongside knowledge. This was where the archive of the unwritten stored its most dangerous document, Soraya's final thesis. She hadn't titled it yet. To name it too early would have been to limit its scope, but its contents were unlike anything she, or anyone, had ever composed. It wasn't just a study, it was an instruction manual for dismantling control systems, disguised as education. It cataloged psychological manipulation embedded in curriculums, listed subtle linguistic biases that rewrote history, and exposed funding trails from academic departments to military black budgets. But that wasn't the part that terrified people. What made the thesis deadly was that it didn't just expose injustice, it weaponized insight. It taught how to undo indoctrination at scale, how to inoculate generations against passive obedience, how to rebuild truth in a world that rewarded comfortable lies. And it did so with surgical precision, backed by over 20 doctorates of cross-disciplinary expertise. Philosophy became resistance, sociology became camouflage, biomechanics became training, even death, mapped and modeled as a social construct, was deconstructed to eliminate fear. When she finished the final paragraph, she didn't cry, she didn't smile, she simply breathed, slowly,
the way a warrior does before releasing the arrow. Marek stood beside her, watching as the thesis was encoded and sealed in 6 different fragments. Each was stored in a different global node, protected by quantum keys that could only be unlocked if 6 separate counter-authorities validated the truth simultaneously. The process was elegant, incorruptible. Soraya's work would never be silenced, because no single force could control it now. But there was one final step. Before it could be distributed, it had to be taught. And not in the quiet corridors of universities, or the lecture halls of state-funded institutions. No, this curriculum was meant for the underground. The disenfranchised, the rebels who didn't know they were scholars, the outcasts, the misfits, the ones the world dismissed as unteachable. Soraya would become a ghost professor. She would teach through encoded graffiti, whispered poems, pirated broadcasts, embedded stories in banned books. Her lessons would travel like a virus, resistant to deletion, contagious to the curious. The irony was poetic. The woman they said was too educated would become the most influential teacher in a world trying desperately to forget how to think. Outside the facility, the van was back. But this time, it wasn't alone. 3 more vehicles arrived, each filled with agents who didn't wear badges. They moved like trained dogs, silent, sharp and used to eliminating threats without making headlines. But as they approached the mineshaft, an alarm buried deep in Soraya's implants flared. They had found her, or so they thought. But she was already gone, not in body, but in meaning. Because the woman they were after was no longer just Soraya El-Amin, academic outcast. She had become an idea, multiplied and embedded in hundreds of minds across the world. The agents descended into the earth. They found the abandoned research terminals. They found pages with formulas they couldn't decipher. And they found a message carved into the wall with the edge of a broken compass. You tried to erase her. She rewrote herself. Above ground in a crowded metro station in Buenos Aires, a young woman opened her phone and decrypted the first lesson of the thesis. In a refugee camp in Aleppo, a boy scribbled a strange equation onto the dirt floor of a temporary school. In a detention cell in Beijing, an old man hummed a melody that contained a memory map of the buried ark. The thesis had been released, and death would never look the same again. The first time Soraya taught the doctrine of unlearning, it wasn't in a classroom. It was in the ruins of a firebombed library. Surrounded by cinders and silence, a group of children sat in a broken circle, their faces lit by the dim glow of burning pages. And she asked only one question: what were you told that made you forget yourself? No one answered at first, but then one by one they spoke. I was told silence meant I was good. I was told asking questions was dangerous. I was told my accent made me less human. Every answer was a revelation, and every revelation was a wound being reopened, so it could finally be healed. This was the first pillar of the doctrine of unlearning, name the lie. The second pillar, trace its origin. Each child was handed a single page from a salvaged textbook, torn at random. They studied the words not for what was printed, but for what was missing. Soraya taught them how to see the scaffolding behind no, whose voices were elevated, whose pain was made abstract, whose truths were footnotes in someone else's triumph. And slowly, the children began to laugh, not out of joy, but out of the absurdity of how much they had believed. They laughed the way people do when waking up from a long nightmare, and realizing the bars on their cages were made of chalk, not steel. The doctrine of unlearning, but not soft. It demanded violence, but not outward, not against others. It demanded the courage to turn the blade inward, and cut away the false self layer below. That's what made it so dangerous to institutions built on obedience. It turned every person into a scholar of their own liberation, a library with legs, a weapon that read and remembered. By the time Soraya made her way to the underground and Lagos, her teachings had already spread. She found a graffiti mural of her own face on a train car. The caption beneath it reading, "She taught us to forget that forgetting." In Tokyo, a protester wore a patch embroidered with their suffrage embroidered with the phrase "unlearned" in script. In a remote Himalayan village, Elders restructured their doors based on a smuggled USB drive containing Soraya's curriculum. And in Washington, D.C., 3 members of a covert psychological warfare team were forced to confront the fact that they had unknowingly trained a generation to resist their own program. It was to make them irrelevant. You didn't burn the book, you wrote a better one, and made sure everyone had a copy. It was here in this final truth that Soraya's impact became irreversible. Because her words no longer needed her voice. They lived in encoded children's songs. They pulsed in low-frequency broadcasts on pirate frequencies. They lingered in symbols etched into alleyways and cities were censored. Soraya had become the inverse of propaganda. She was literacy with a pulse, cognition with teeth, hope dressed like heresy. She didn't seek revenge on the institutions that tried to crush her. She replaced them, and when the last government official demanded to know, where's the origins of this doctrine, the only answer they received was a data trail pointing in every direction. At once, there was no longer a source, there was only a movement, and it was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on you. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from